Okay, so where we were yesterday was we had looked at just the constitutional constraints, and then we were looking at constitutional powers. Again, what we're trying to understand is the evolution of the executive branch in terms of how did it become one of the most, arguably, the most powerful branch. And then we're going to look at the implications of that, because that, again, follows how the AP tests look. So to kind of consider that growth of power, we started with the idea of constraints. Here's what's in the Constitution, but we also looked at kind of the reality. For example, yes, there are three formal requirements to hold office, but we've got some informal ones. Yes, we have a method to remove, but do we always use it as was intended? On and on. And now what we're looking at is the constitutional power. So we looked at restraints, now we're looking at powers, and we're doing the same kind of thing. Here's what's on paper. Here's some of the subtext. Here's how that power actually gets used in reality. So based on what we talked about yesterday, and I'll save the warm-up, but what we've kind of run through so far is the idea of executive power, okay? So you want to know what it means to have executive power, and then how has the president been able to kind of gain expanded power because of the vague language. And we talked about things like, the ability to control personnel, the ability to control a budget, the ability to use executive orders and signing statements. We then looked at the role as commander-in-chief. And again, there's just the language of Congress declaring war, the president having the power of commander-in-chief. Over time, that worked out so that the president's role superseded Congress's role. That presidents wage war, Congress declares war, and Congress allows. You'd have to know a little bit about efforts to rein the president in with the War Powers Act, but why that still doesn't work. So again, what you see here is power on paper that allowed the president the ability to claim an expanded role, okay? And you'd want to know kind of the why. Hardening power. There's a real kind of clear logic to this. And so again, you'd want to know kind of the intent, but also how has it been used historically? Has it been used as it's intended? And what is the implications of using it? We talked about a lot of one-term presidents. Where we were now is on the power of appointment. These three bullets here really are the ones that we talk about with appointment. But I include treaties here because the Senate does have the power of advice and consent. Now, this is an instance where Congress, in some ways, has begun to limit the president because often, typically for ideological reasons, most of the president's appointments are facing stricter scrutiny. And they're using the filibuster or the threat of the filibuster to stall appointments. And what I tried to show you is, starting with Clinton and then starting with Reagan and then going to Bush and then Clinton, and we can kind of continue that trajectory, the amount of time where there's a vacancy, there's an appointee for a position, a post, and you've got a nominee, and we're waiting for a hearing and a vote on that nominee, and that time drags from 30 months to 60 months to 90 months. You've got 3-month vacancies, and now it's like 4, 5, 6-month vacancies where posts, where positions aren't filled, and therefore there's no leadership structure. In the notes, there's a maybe what seems like a confusing jumble, but there's this consideration that is kind of perennial. It keeps coming up, where the Senate debates, do we get rid of this kind of practice? Do we get rid of the filibuster? Maybe not everywhere, but do we get rid of it with respect to appointees? Getting rid of it is called the nuclear option because it's it's like a nuclear bomb. It's the damage that they feel it would reap is parallel, because it's a cherished tool of the minority. It's one that they use to protect against the tyranny of the majority. However, you've still got kind of what seems like an abuse, so they do consider it. And I've got kind of documented the back and forth that happened up to that point most recently, where there was a bipartisan gang of 14, and they came up with an agreement to let certain nominees through. And that kind of caused everybody to calm down and not exercise that nuclear option. That having been said, the most recent Senate, we have a new kind of, Congress that just got seated the other day, but the most recent Senate did finally exercise that nuclear option with respect to judicial nominees. So that still is kind of a contentious issue. What you would see, again, on an AP test, they love questions of reform. They love kind of, where is there a need for reform, and kind of not necessarily the why, but what are the, political implications of this problem, and why can't reform be achieved, all right? So that's something you might navigate with it. At any rate, this is something that constrains the president. Let's skip all of that. What you see is presidents have found some pretty creative ways around the Senate obstruction, the Senate kind of stalling. One of the things that they've used in the past is the idea of assigning someone and giving them not the official title. You won't move on my appointee, so I don't have a head of this agency or department. I'm going to have to put someone in who is the acting department head or the acting kind of agency head, right? So this is a way to kind of get around it. They also sometimes use the fact that the Senate is away on recess to get someone through. You're away, it's kind of like a pocket veto. You're not here to object, so I'm just going to simply kind of unilaterally appoint them because you're away. Again, this is outside the appointment process, but again, because the Senate has that power of advice and consent, they can also use it to thwart presidents with respect to treaties. Wilson learned that lesson, and kind of in a bitter sense, had done so much to negotiate the treaty that concluded World War I, had his League of Nations, and then had his own Senate shut him down. So again, presidents have found kind of trapdoor ways to kind of get treaties through. I've got trapdoor ways to get appointees through. I've got trapdoor ways to get treaties through. One is to fast track it, to kind of designate a foreign agreement as something that needs a up or down vote. You can't attach amendments. You can't stall on it. I fast tracked this agreement. We have a timetable with the other country. You have 90 days to vote this up or down. Give me a vote. It prevents, the use of amendments as a way to kind of submarine and sabotage something. They can also issue executive agreements. Now, it's kind of interesting. It's like an executive order, but it's, where it's, again, a unilateral, not statement, but declaration that has the force of law. But in this case, it involves another country, all right? So the only thing that precludes a president from using executive agreement is if someone finds it unconstitutional. But that's kind of interesting because often the president can, as he's issuing this executive agreement, claim the idea that there has to be a degree of secrecy. There's a need for national security here. I'm not going to give you the full details for that reason. So at any rate, these are two kind of trapdoor ways: fast track and executive agreements with respect to treaties. All right. Power to convene Congress is another. Again, we've looked at constraints. This is another power given to the president that allows them to check the other branches. How substantial is it? I would say from a symbolic level, it's pretty substantial. The idea that the president at times of crises can call Congress to session if they're in recess, or can call Congress together in a joint conference. They can use that power pretty effectively on a symbolic level. Look at what the president's doing. The president has done something constructive in support and political capital goes to the president. In terms of its actual use, though, it's largely symbolic because Congress is in session nearly year-round. So, the need actually to call them back for some sort of crisis rarely happens because they're there anyways. Again, why you would convene them together is for that powerful photo op of the president saying, there's a crisis, I'm bringing both people to the chamber, and I'm issuing a call to action. That's where the real value comes in. Again, if you look at how often they're in session, it's almost year-round. All right? Veto power is another thing that the president can use to constrain the other branches. Now, we've been over this one, so this kind of goes quickly. We talked about this as we talked about how a bill becomes a law. The thing that you need to remember about the veto power is when a bill reaches the president's desk, they actually have 4 options: to sign it, to formally veto it. I am going to, this is a reminder to me, I put the articles here. I'm going to give you those articles that show you, even when the president is signing it, if they issue that signing statement, how much they can shape legislation, just using that public forum and using that public forum not only to kind of cue the viewers, but cue the departments and agencies. So I'll show you that. At any rate, you can sign the bill, but that doesn't mean you have to go along with it 100%. They have a lot of ways, as we've talked about earlier, to shape it, or they can veto it. The veto, again, we know Congress has the option of overriding by a 2/3 majority. And if you guys can kind of remember percentages, how often has an override succeeded? Does anybody remember that percentage? Is it a lot? No. Is it double digit? No. So we're in the single digits, 4%, right? So sometimes numbers, it's going to be hard. There's a lot of numbers coming at you, but that may be one that you hold on to. You do have the option of a pocket veto, and I kind of hinted at that. There's kind of two factors that need to be in place for a pocket veto. Who remembers? What do you need for a pocket veto?
Congress needs to be out of session, and it has to be 10 days without being in session.
Without president, yeah, they need to be out of session for 10 days, and the president lets it sit on his desk or her desk for 10 days without signature, right? So we've got them out of session in the time frame. If you reverse it, if Congress is in session and 10 days pass and the president hasn't signed it, what happens? Well, no, but I'm going to talk about that in a second. It passes. It becomes law. But you mentioned a line item veto, which is what? Line item. I got a bill. What is
do they change?
Kind of. You're close.
They vote parts of it.
So the president wouldn't necessarily vote parts of it out, but he would veto or simply cross out a line. So use the word to your advantage. There is this idea of a line item veto that the president can use to cross off certain sections of legislation. They gave the president, anybody remember, it was a Republican Congress following that sweep of '94 that gave Clinton, the Democrat, this power. What was he going to be crossing out in legislation that we all see as kind of a corrupt kind of practice within politics? What do people attach to the laws that they wanted Clinton to cross out?
Riders.
Yeah, the riders. And what do we call them when we're calling them kind of in the negative, when they're really being used just for the benefit of your district? That pork barrel legislation, those riders, those earmarks, that pork barrel legislation, where I'm bringing a bit of financial benefit to my state, my district, at the bigger public expense. There's arguably no larger national benefit. It gets ruled unconstitutional. Does anybody remember why? It seems like a good thing. Congress can't figure out how to restrain itself. It's like asking you guys if you had complete autonomy, would you always set the right limits for yourself, right? If I made you the police of your own kind of behavior, Would that always be a good thing? Sometimes we need external kind of restraints, otherwise we get ourselves in trouble. So they try to say, hey, I can't do it. I can't stick to this diet. I can't stick to this exercise regimen. I'm staying up too late. Here, President, you kind of be in charge of us. But the problem is, anybody know why it was ruled unconstitutional?
Gives too much power to the president.
Well, that's a good argument. It certainly does. And if you were to give that kind of power to the president, what would you need to say it's constitutional?
Likewise, check.
So some other kind of counterbalance. That's good. Is it there? No. So to kind of use your answer to get around it, you've given the president a substantial amount of power with no check without any language justifying this. There's no language that suggests a partial check being given to the president. Okay? Therefore, they struck it down. Felt like there was one other thing I wanted to say about the line item veto. We'll see if it comes back to me. So at any rate, these are again, if we're just looking at constitutional things, we've looked at restraints, we've looked at things that are intended to check the other branches, but we've also looked at their kind of informal use. So tomorrow is kind of a form of a warm-up. I'm going to ask you to kind of go through those checks to try to remember as many checks that the president has against the other branches, and you're going to try to remember them in as specific terms as possible, you know, if there's numbers or percentages. But then what I want is also how is the check used in reality? You know, to compare kind of what's the intent versus what's the use. Where we also go tomorrow is to look at the informal powers. That the president, because of expectations that we have, you know, I joked the other day, you fall into a pothole and you blame not just government, you blame specifically Obama. It's got to be his fault that I fell down. The singular nature of the office makes the president the face of government. And because of that, we expect the president, you know, if there's a war and it doesn't go well, we put it on the president. If there's an economic downturn, we put it on the president. If there's an economic upturn, we put it on the president. If a law fails to kind of, you know, and reform fails to get passed, we put it on the president. On and on it goes. So what happens is because of our expectations, all of a sudden we're putting a bunch of hats on the president. That's how you explain it to like the ninth graders. The president wears many hats. Here's my chief executive hat. Here is my chief legislator hat. Here's my manager of prosperity hat. So we'll go through all the chiefs tomorrow. And what we're going to talk about is how is this role good for the president and bad for the president. All right? I'll put a pin in it because I'm missing 30% of you.